Hello, my name is Ari Hoffman, and I want to warmly welcome you to this Z3 conversation. Z3 is an annual conference that aims to evolve and advance Zionism. It brings together Israel and the diaspora for frank, interesting, and hard-hitting conversations about the future of these two communities and their shared destiny. This year's Z3 will take place December 5th. It will be a hybrid event combining live programming with streamed content. The theme this year is Futures Workshop and will revolve around a simulation, a real-life scenario that will bring together thinkers, stakeholders, writers, and activists to envision what the future looks like. To prepare for this conference, I am so lucky to be joined by two of the most acute observers of the Jewish American and Israeli scene. Shmuel Rosner is the senior fellow at the Jewish People's Institute. He's a columnist at the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv and the senior political editor at the LA Jewish Journal. His newest book, Israeli Judaism, is a seminal contribution to the study of Israeli Judaism and its evolutions and future. Dr. Bethany Horowitz was a former director of policy planning and research for the UJA New York Federation. She was also the chief scientist for the Mandel Foundation and is a specialist in Jewish American life. Shmuel and Bethany, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Bethany, let me start with you. What do you think is the biggest story in American Judaism today?
Thanks for the question. I think the biggest story is the stability and diversity of Jews in America. There's a story of population, which if we talked 10 years ago, I think people were still feeling a little queasy about whether there would be, well, not whether there would be Jews, but just that it was declining. And certainly the latest Pew study that was done in 2020, the data gathering was in 2020, it was just released in 2021, shows that we're at 7.3 million Jews, up from 6.8 7 years ago. So that's continuing. And the other thing is that people are proudly Jewish. So that's one thing, is the size. And the other thing is that the diversity of ways of being Jewish. So at the population level, that's what's going on. At the institutional level and the sort of ideas level, there's other things. But I just want to start with this. Let's take the bull by the horns in terms of addressing the fears of demise, which I think are way overstated.
And that's so true. For so long, the worry of disappearance was sort of the headline. And how interesting and paradoxical that, in fact, the Jewish population is growing. And that brings its own attendant challenges. But the story, maybe, the lesson is the story is rarely what we think it is. Shmuel, let me go over to you in Tel Aviv. What for you is the most exciting development happening now among Israeli Jews?
Well, to answer this question, we have to define both what you mean by exciting and what you mean by now. I'll go for a historical analogy, or maybe even two. I spent my last Shabbat reading a wonderful biography of President James Polk. Now, James Polk was president at about the time that is the equivalence of where Israel is today. For those who don't remember, Polk was the president in charge of annexing what today is the Western United States, states of Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and Oregon and Washington. All of it was taken into the United States at his time. The U.S. was about 70 years old at that time. This was many years ago. The US was very young. Israel is as young today. And this is something that we tend to forget. We tend to forget how early we are in the trajectory of where Israel started and where it is going. Now, the second historic nugget that I will I'd pull at such occasion is to remind you what happened in this region in the last 100 years or so. So 1918, when World War I ended, there were 60,000 Jews living in then Palestine. 30 years later, 1948, the state of Israel was born. We were 600,000, 10 times more Jews in this area. And at about 3 or 4 years ago, Israel crossed the 6 million Jews threshold, and we are now even more than 7 million. So this dramatic demographic rise of Jews in this region and their ability to gradually create their own culture, even though it is still very young, I find it exciting. I'm not sure about you, but I think it's very exciting. And even though it involves certain what you'd call culture wars in the United States, I'm not afraid of culture wars. I find them, if they don't go out of hand, I think they are interesting, they are exciting, they are important, and they are the way with which Israel gradually establishes its own independent culture.
Thank you so much for that. On the one hand, I think you've given us a really interesting historical context. In my wildest dreams, I couldn't have hoped that President Polk would have come up in our conversation this morning. But your point is well taken, and I think it's often observed that in the 8th decade of a country's life, oftentimes dramatic developments begin to happen. That it's no longer in its original birth pangs, and it's almost perhaps in its kind of adolescence, which can be a kind of a period of growth and change as well. And the other note that you've mentioned is the sort of particular history of Jews in the Middle East and the way in which it's reset the population of Jews around the world and has surpassed 50% of worldwide Jewry. So on that optimistic note, let me turn back to Bethany and ask, what worries you the most in the American Jewish scene in particular, and what gives you hope?
I think that the worrisome things are, actually I want to pick up in a certain way from Shmuel's historical framing, because in a certain way American Jews are also at a point in their development that is a big change. So I'm not going to rehearse a whole history of when Jews came to America, but I think most people know or should know that the huge immigration that happened in the end of the 19th into the 20th century really set the terms for the American Judaism we saw through the 20th century. The huge European immigration that ended in 1924 meant that we had the story then was the melding of the East Europeans and the German Jews who had been here earlier. And they created at that moment in time, in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s into the 1900s, the institutional framework that has held through today. Although that's when you ask me about what's challenging, those institutions, so many of them were founded with the concerns of the late 1800s and into the 1900s. And what we're facing now is an established American Jewish community that needs new institutions. So let me just point out a couple of things that have changed. I mentioned size, okay, and the sort of trajectory of the sort of descendants of those immigrants creating these institutions. And then we have a new influx of almost 300,000 or 400,000 immigrants from the former Soviet Union, from South Africa, from Latin America, all in the past 30 years. We have a very confident, a younger American Jewry than existed. If you go back 75 years ago, or Mordechai Kaplan, who founded Reconstructionist Judaism. He was a rabbi, but he was actually a very fine sociologist, in my view. And he reported that the view of Jewishness in his time was as if you lived with a diseased organ, as if your heart was holding you back. It was a source of pain. So the sense of disability from being Jewish was profound through the first half of the 20th century. And what changed in the second half of the 20th century was that we became part of the mainstream. We helped create the mainstream for Catholics and Jews. When Kennedy was elected, that was because of the joining of the minorities. And we became part of what is now whiteness emerged. And but my main point, since you're asking me about what I'm fearful about or what I'm concerned about, is the need to reinvent Jewish institutions and Jewish organizational framework. I think Jews are doing great. I think Jews are proud to be Jewish. There used to be an undertow pulling people away from being Jewish, and the fears about intermarriage, which were profound beginning in the, certainly by the 1990s, there were all kinds of hue and cry about it. The sense was that if people intermarried, they would leave Judaism. That presumed that Jewishness wasn't something attractive and appreciated. And it's become a very different environment in which to be Jewish, an environment Jews helped to create, and the institutions need to catch up. And I think people are working hard at that. So we have mainstream institutions that are trying to reinvent themselves, and we've got a lot of unexpected and new things that are coming up along the way. And so that's one thing. And I want to put out one other thing, which is the character of Judaism today, which has to do with this. I think the kind of main thing people did Jewishly 50 years ago was, you were supposed to show up in temple, in synagogue, in shul. And people do that, but it's less frequent, I think. I'm not speaking about the most Orthodox part of the population, the 13% that is there. But I think the mitzvah of study, of limud Torah in a very broad sense, the interest and curiosity that people have in Jewishness, Jewish history, Jewish memory, literature, it includes Israeli culture and the products of Israel too. I think that has grown hugely. We saw it beginning in the 1990s with the rise of Jewish studies in the universities. Even people who had lousy Hebrew school, which was one stereotype about Jewish education, in college had all kinds of opportunities to do serious thought and reading and study. And the appetite for learning in all sorts of ways, whether it's Daf Yomi, which is obviously studying Talmud and the sort of Orthodox framework, although it's also liberal Judaism has adopted that, but also in all kinds of courses and the Wexner Fellows, and there's a whole bunch of things that are going on, and new places of learning. There's liberal and across the spectrum there are things. So I think that's a source of hope. And it's part of what I'm describing as the need to reinvent, which was what I was concerned about. So I'm concerned about one thing, and I see evidence that it's being responded to.
Right. Well, it's sort of a fascinating story you tell of paradox, right? On the one hand, a sort of thriving culture. On the other, perhaps a set of, if not failing, struggling institutions. And I think most American Jews, whether of the right, left, or center, would acknowledge that. That somehow the organs of American Jewish life are not doing what they need to do. And the other paradox I hear you mentioning, Bethany, is this sort of strange sense in which, on the one hand, interest in study has increased. On the other hand, in shorthand, interest in prayer has decreased. I think one could tell a story of American Jewry where it's sort of everyone wants to learn and nobody wants to pray. And it's sort of interesting to think about why that is, and whether synagogues need to sort of reimagine what they are in the face of that reality.
Although I'm not sure it's that they don't want to pray. I mean, it depends on what you mean by pray. I think there's been a feature of American Jewry that's really reinvented Jewish spirituality, and that doesn't need to happen. It happens in the synagogue, and it doesn't need to happen only in the synagogue. And that's one of the products of American Judaism is in the past 30 years is that that's really blossomed.
Sure. The move into the home and sort of
into nature, into
and online.
And online, absolutely.
Yeah. So Shmuel, to kind of go back to you, this broad story of American Jewry, where we have elements of cultural strength and components of institutional failure. Does that sort of track with your read of the sort of Israeli situation? Oftentimes people will say Israeli culture has never been stronger, Israeli politics has never or has rarely been weaker. And I ask this because when you mentioned your study of President Polk, you mentioned the sort of the geopolitical dimensions of that moment in time. And so when you think about Israeli Judaism, how do you think about sort of the private sphere, the public sphere? Of course, in Israel, the two overlap.
Well, first of all, that's the most important fact about Israeli Judaism. In Israel, you don't have Jewish institutions and then general institutions. The institutions of the state are the institutions that we have. We don't have separate Jewish institutions on which we can speak as if they are in a separate sphere. Jews in Israel live and breathe their Jewish culture. Part of in the book that I wrote with my colleague, Professor Camille Fuchs of Tel Aviv University, we call this effortless Judaism. Judaism in Israel is something that people do without having to think about it much, to invest too much effort in it. This is how we live. This is the air that we breathe. And when we think about our institutions, we don't think about them as Jewish institutions. You know, it's a government. It's a government. It has offices. Some of them are more efficient, some less so. With some of the politics, you are more satisfied, with some less so. I must say that up until 2016, I used to and was patient with American friends who came forward telling me that Israeli politics is impossible to comprehend. But when President Trump was elected and afterwards, I no longer hear such complaints. So even though Israeli politics is far from being perfect, I don't think it's compared badly when you look at other countries, especially the United States. What we do have in Israel, and this is something that most Jews in other places or Jews from previous generations cannot truly understand, is that Jews in Israel, for the first time in many generations, are learning to live as a majority in their country. And that's a new experience, a new Jewish experience that we are not used to. Something that we need to gradually develop. We need to develop a new language for a Jewish majority, a new culture for a Jewish majority, a new understanding of the circumstances of a Jewish majority. All of this is taking place, and it's taking place in a country that also has some other challenges to deal with, some of them in the geopolitical sphere, challenges that we all know about, whether it's nuclear Iran or the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or other things that we must deal with. And also the fact that Israel started as a country of many communities of immigrants. 70 years ago, when the country was born, there were Polish Jews and Romanian Jews and Moroccan Jews and Yemenite Jews. And only now we are beginning to see something that we can call Israeli Jews that emerges out of it. The generations of immigrants are in the past, and the new generation is a generation of Israeli-born Israeli Jews, and they behave differently and they feel differently about themselves, about the communities, about their culture. It feels much more natural for them to behave the way they do, and you know they're still working on this culture. It's not we're not yet done. This is a work in progress.
Let me ask you on that point, and because this conference is called Z3, I mean, what, in your opinion, if Judaism in Israel is effortless, and if the institutions have been built, what is sort of the next frontier of Zionism? It's no secret that the word itself here in the United States has come under attack from those on the left who have sought to decouple Jewishness from statehood somehow, or troubled by the confluence of the two. But as someone living in Israel, what do you think, is Zionism still a relevant term? Is it still a useful term? And is it still an important term to chart the path forward?
Well, it's relevant in the sense that this is a term that animates 7-8 million Jews who live in Israel and many who live in other countries. It is relevant in the sense that this is the core, the basic tenet of what animates Israel itself. And whether other people in the world are happy with it or dissatisfied with it is mostly irrelevant to most of us. Jews in Israel feel strongly about their identity. They feel strongly about their country. They are patriotic. Their patriotism and their Jewishness is one and the same. There is no difference. You cannot differentiate in Israel between, quote unquote, your Jewish identity and your Israeli identity. These are one and the same. And to most Israelis, when they celebrate Hanukkah or when they celebrate Independence Day, these are two Jewish Israeli holidays, one of which commemorates something that happened to Jews 2,000 years ago or even more, and one commemorates something that happened to Jews just 70-something years ago. But in both cases, this is about Jewish pride, Jewish identity, Jewish solidarity, and all the other things that make us a people.
Thank you so much. To turn back to Bethany, I find that as someone who loves Israel deeply and is a proud Zionist, I find that vision inspiring. However, I worry because that seems so different to me than most American Jews understand their identity, specifically around the confluence of the sort of religious and the national. And so I'm wondering about, sort of as you hear Shmuel paint a picture of Israeli Judaism, and as you've spent time studying Judaism here, are you struck by those differences to you? Does it seem a sort of a widening gulf, or a growing gap, or are there points of contact and tangent?
Well, the thing that struck me sort of in a live way, and that's what makes a conversation like this interesting, because although we had sort of some advanced notice of what the topics would be, hearing Shmuel talk has now made me want to address it. You talk about the comfort level and the complete identity of identity between Israeliness and Jewishness. And I'm wondering, what about the Christian and Muslim citizens of the state? Israel isn't a state that's only Jewish. And so, and the reason that matters to me as an American Jew is that we in America, Jews in America, have really thrived because of the civil society and the democracy that values and has to work hard at valuing all the people that live here and the dignity of the people and their communities. And we struggle with it. Of course, there's issues that aren't perfect in either country. But when the mainstream speaks only of itself, that doesn't include the others that live there, it's a problem. Right. And that would be sort of a cautionary note that I, as an American, worry about here. And I'm not trying to say what Israel has to do. I think my country is America, and I have very deep feelings and strong connections to Israel, but I don't view it as my country where I exercise the same kind of responsibilities. Maybe there's different responsibilities of Jews towards Israel, which we ought to discuss. But with my responsibilities as a citizen here is to make it a place where everybody can thrive. Mm-hmm. And I'm concerned when I hear a story of Israel that's only Jewish, when we know there are so many others living there. It's not equal numbers, but the dignity of the Palestinian population in Israel and the others, it matters, I think. It certainly matters to American Jews.
Yeah, and maybe, Shmuel, maybe you can, in response to that, thinking a little bit about what it means to be a majority, right? And what the opportunities and what the challenges are of the project of being a Jewish majority.
Well, as I said, this is something that we need to learn. Being a Jewish majority is a new experience for us. And obviously, when Jews in Israel think about themselves as Israeli Jews, they create two challenges for themselves. One is with Jews who aren't Israeli, such as American Jews. And the other one is with Israeli who aren't Jews, such as Arab Israelis. And obviously, these two challenges is something that we have to find a way to overcome. We need to be able to be as inclusive as possible of all citizens in Israel who aren't Jewish, even though Israel was established as the nation state of the Jewish people. And we also need to find a way to communicate with those Jews who aren't Israelis and do not intend to be Israelis. So these two challenges exist. We must acknowledge them. We must think about them. But this doesn't mean that Israel must stop being Israel or must not be the nation state of the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Let me ask you both a question, and that's about language. Do you think in the long run, the fact that American Jews by and large don't speak Hebrew is an important factor? Oftentimes you hear discussion of sort of what can bring these two communities together? And one of the things I wonder about is whether they simply don't share the same language. The fact that American Jews can't read Hebrew newspapers, for example, or that they're forced to read insightful commentators like Shmuel in the New York Times or elsewhere, but in English. And so, what do you think? What are the things that can bring these two communities, if not in agreement, in at least conversation?
Well, I've always thought language matters. I mean, I'm my own name, Bethany, is Bat Ami. I was raised with Hebrew. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. So my story is not the typical story. And I raised my family so that we've spent time in Israel. Our kids speak Hebrew. And I think language matters hugely, at least to me. But I think it's been there's been a long-standing effort to create Hebrew in America, but it's not taken by the majority. Mm-hmm. So I think, I do agree with Bialik that, reading in translation is like kissing somebody behind a veil. Mm-hmm. So, I do think that that's a problem. It's also true that that English has become a kind of lingua franca. To think of all these weird, right. It's become a shared language internationally, right. And that has helped. But there's ways of communicating despite this language limitation. I do think there's been other ways of translating and accessing culture and the mindset and the thinking in both directions. That's possible. You can now read newspapers in ways that you couldn't. When I was growing up, my father was a rabbi and. In Cleveland, and he would be the conduit for information about Israel in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Sure. And the access to Hebrew papers has just changed. And in translation, anybody can read Haaretz now, or Ma'ariv. Ma'ariv less so. I don't know. Is it in translation? I haven't seen it. But so that ability to access is there. And the sharing of culture, of cultures, American Jewish and Israeli, and American, it is very possible. There's so much that gets exported from Israel to the United States or to other places. So I think that there is a barrier. I'd prefer that people could appreciate each other in the natural language of the place. But realistically, I think we have to accept that there's other avenues for access.
Right, it's another sort of story of paradox. Perhaps never has American Jewry been more critical of Israel, more divided of Israel, though that itself is debatable, and yet never in some ways has American Jewry known more about Israel. And more people have gone on trips and things like Birthright, or watched the Israeli invasion of Netflix, things like that. Right? So we have this sort of wide exporting of culture, even as we have these points of tension. And to throw it back to Shmuel, I mean, I think there was a thinking on behalf of Jewish American organizations that the more people got to know Israel, the more supportive of it they'd be. I wonder whether that story still holds. And Shmuel, from your perspective, what do you think Israel needs from American Jews, or wants from American Jews?
Well, it needs and wants love from American Jews and unconditional support. That's the obvious answer. This is what everybody wants from someone who's within one's own family. If we are family, and in some way that's the way I see myself, and the way I relate to American Jews is like family. And if you're my family, then I root for you, I support you, and I love you in some way. And sometimes I get annoyed by you. This is also a constant feature of being a family. I'm not that troubled by the fact that people are being or becoming critical of Israel. I don't see it as a dramatic development. I think Israel should feel now secure enough and strong enough to be able to, get criticized and either shrug it off or get some good advice and use it to its benefit. For American Jews, there is no alternative. It's not as if tomorrow they can say, well, we no longer support Israel. We are now moving to support Switzerland, and this will be our nation state of the Jewish people. There's one nation state of the Jewish people. It exists. It's becoming stronger. And whether you want this or not, it's part of Jewish reality today that cannot be ignored. Now, as to creating a shared basis for communication and for discussion and for having relations, Hebrew would be a good start, but I agree with Bethany that this is an unrealistic challenge. Learning a language is a very demanding task. I don't expect all Jews to study Hebrew, but I would set, maybe a more modest goal, like let's have everybody know 300 words in Hebrew, 500 words in Hebrew. Let's create some kind of vocabulary that all Jews share and nobody else shares. Having something that is not just shared by us, but also unique to our special tribe, I think is of some importance. And other than that, my advice would be to deal as little as possible with politics, which divides us, and as much as possible with other things such as music, theater, literature, culture in general, or studying Daf Yomi, as Bethany said earlier. The more we study together, the more we think about our common history and common ideals and common thinkers, the more we can relate to one another. The more we think about politics, politics doesn't create friends, it creates enemies. So I would not prescribe it to anyone.
I like that a lot. 500 words, let's split the difference, let's say 400, and a focus on culture. Bethany, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, again, it's nice to be provoked. I'm certainly not against people learning words and sharing things, but I think that when you focus only on what's in common and you ignore elephants in the room, it's a problem. And my own research, looking at it's been believed that the best way to promote love of Israel and connection to Israel is to immerse people in Israel for a long haul, like a year. I've been studying year-long programs, and to make sure they meet lots of Israelis, the mifgash, the sort of encounter with peers in particular. And those are good strategies, but when things are unsettled, as they have been, and I don't mean only about politics like, okay, do you like Netanyahu or not like Netanyahu? I mean politics that relates to existential issues of the day and moral questions and the sort of underlying issues. I think that what I've learned from studying two different programs is one has focused on the time, the sort of by now longstanding habit of immersion and mifgash, of meeting Israelis. And I don't think it's enough. The other program has focused on decoding, on having people meet and struggle with having them ask very good questions about what are they seeing and what confuses them and what bothers them and what do they like, and just asking good questions about what is a foreign experience. American Jews aren't Israeli. So if you bring people to Israel, or if you want people to love Israel, you have to first let them see where they stand vis-a-vis questions that they take for granted, or they maybe haven't thought of until they see it in the Israeli context, or they translate, sometimes for better or for worse, what they see in America to Israel and ask questions. And I think having space for American Jews to do that with the choreography of good educators is very important. The program I'm thinking of does a very good job of situating Israel not only as a story in and of itself. It visits diaspora places where Jews live and have lived, and asks, well, what were the troubles and good things? There was coexistence, and there were also, we know that the sort of lacharismos, the sort of tale of Judaism that's about woe and loss and destruction. But it's not only a story of that then leads to Israel. And so there have been basic questions that each society has had to relate to. Jews as minorities in places where the majority sometimes taught that they lived well there, and sometimes they didn't live well there, and sometimes it ebbed and flowed. And can we learn from that? Can we learn from how what it means for Israel to be a majority, how we decode that and sort of have reactions to it that are important to surface? And I feel like I'm meandering a little bit. My main point is that for us to be able to have a relationship with Israel, it's not to presume love and even family. It's to presume interest, curiosity, some affinity, and you have to grow that. So I'm not sure that the old love and loyalty model, which we had for since the founding of the state, and certainly in the pre-state period, I'm not sure that that's the note I want to sound for the challenges going forward. The note I want to sound is a bit different, and it's honoring the Americanness of American Jews as a base, and letting that be the basis of a conversation of how does it mean to live in society today, whether as a minority, a very advantaged minority here, and as a majority in a country that has other people and has its challenges of different sorts, and wonderful things too. I'm not trying to make it only about the hard stuff, but if we don't address the hard stuff and create space for that, and you just focus on the 300 words and the fact that we watch different versions of Homeland or Fauda or whatever. If you're watching Fauda, you're asking questions. Right. So Homeland too. Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, I think just to bring these 2 points together, it's as Shmuel said. I mean, there's no Switzerland option, right? So we're in some ways stuck with each other, and my sort of just anecdotal look around the Jewish American world suggests that questions of Israel have quickly become sort of defining politically. And there were times when debates over halakha or debates over kashrut were sort of animating the Jewish American world, or even debates over intermarriage. So in my again anecdotal view, those have been somewhat muted. And the New York Times Magazine isn't running pieces on fierce debates about keeping kosher. It's running pieces on Israel and on where American Jews stand vis-a-vis Israel. So I think engagement is a must, and it has to happen on these different levels. I'm reminded of the famous exchange and debate between the philosopher Hannah Arendt and the scholar Gershom Scholem about Ahavat Yisrael, right? And what are the obligations of Ahavat Yisrael? And sort of Scholem's point that, you know, to love another Jew, to love the Jewish state is an unconditional absolute. And Arendt's rejoinder, right, that somehow love it can also be criticism or critique. And so in some ways, the Jewish American, some parts of the Jewish American world now seem to be Arendtian in that way, that they seem to argue that their love is expressed through criticism, as I'm sure many Israelis would agree to as well. Let me just ask a final question. Our time is wrapping up, and to sort of start where Shmuel began with looking backwards. Let me ask you to kind of look forward, and you know, in the next, I don't know, quarter century, let's say, in the next 25 years, what is the sort of big story, that you're tracking? I know it's easy to live day to day and headline to headline, especially in the Middle East, but in broad strokes, where do you think our viewers should be paying attention? Shmuel, go ahead first.
Well, since you're asking about Israel, I assume that first of all we have to deal with the geopolitical questions. As much as I'd like to talk about Israeli culture and how it evolves in the next 25 years, the first question for Israel is how it survives and thrives in a fairly difficult area, being able to get even stronger than it is today, both economically, militarily, diplomatically, in all possible aspects. And then I think what we are about to see is a continuation of this process of building a new language of independent, majoritarian Jewish culture. What does it mean to live in a majority Jewish culture, namely in a place in which you do not have to channel your Jewishness neither through a synagogue nor through a Jewish institution of some kind, but rather to live your Jewishness as your daily life. That's the Israeli challenge, and do all this without losing the essence of Jewishness, without making it so blasé and you know, understated that it begins to be boring. One of the advantages, or one of the things that we can learn from American Jews, and I spent many years in North America, both in Canada and in the United States, and one of the things that I learned from American Jews is the need to invest effort in one's Jewishness, not to take it for granted. The danger for Israelis is that they take their Jewishness for granted. The challenge for them is to live with their Jewishness effortlessly and naturally without deteriorating into this state of not being able to invest effort and thought and emotion in keeping their culture.
Thank you so much for that account of sort of the challenges to the Jewish body and the challenges to the Jewish soul, I think, which go hand in hand. Bethany, what about for you? What about in this country? Where do you see this story going, or what is worth watching?
I think what's worth watching is the ways that the most innovative things that are happening among American Jews are drawing on wisdom from Jewish civilization, wisdom from Jewish literature, Jewish text, and trying to use it as a resource to answer big questions that we face as a society and as a world. I mean, like around climate, which we haven't talked about, and you know, the idea that the notion of Shemitah, the idea that you are a steward of the earth, and that you might need to give things a rest, or create a respite, create a space where things can be recalibrated. There are people working on that here in the world of ecology and of farming. I mean, there's Jewish things going on that in very improbable ways. I mean, I was kind of skeptical about them when I first heard about it 25 years ago, and it's been an amazing thing to watch watch the ways that people are speaking to issues in the world, but from a Jewish place and not a cloistered place. It's like viewing Judaism as a resource for anyone who wants to take, anyone who wants to benefit from it. And to me, that's the most interesting thing. And it's in a funny way, Shmuel, it's parallel to your idea of natural Jewishness. It's not an idea that it's cloistered and you keep it inside and it's only about protecting practice. It's about helping us thrive, helping our societies thrive, helping the world remain. So I think that this attitude of being a citizen, a comfortable citizen in your place, and a citizen in the world also, that you have the responsibility to bring what you can from your background into the shared property that has many others in it who may be, and to create allies and work together to improve things with a tikkun olam framework. Making the world better is something. There are non-Jewish institutions. There's a foundation called Tikkun Olam that's not Jewish. And so people have found these notions helpful. It's not that they don't have a concept of it, but maybe the way of that some people have framed, Judaism handling these things has been helpful, and that to me is exciting.
Wonderful. I'm reminded of the line from the great Jewish American writer Cynthia Ozick, who said that if you blow into the narrow end of the shofar, and the sound comes out the wide
beautiful.
End, right?
Yeah.
And you get the greatest resonance. I want to thank both Shmuel and Bethany so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. I encourage you to follow their work. I know of no more keen observers of the Jewish world than the two people I've been privileged to speak to. I also want to encourage all of our viewers to come to the main event, to Z3 December 5th, whether you're able to attend online, wherever you are, or in person in beautiful Palo Alto, California. Please make it your business to be there. In the meantime, I encourage you also to think of yourself as a partner and a participant in this conversation. This is how the future is going to get made. So thank you so much for joining us today, and all the best, and happy Hanukkah. Bye-bye.